What is the scariest moment you have ever witnessed or have been told in your life? Story 1. Pet sitting for an aunt while she and her family vacationed for a week. I was around 10 at the time. My sister and my mom were there too. Daytime was great. They left us snacks and goodies, and I got to play all the M-rated MW2 I wanted on my cousin's console. When it started to get dark though, strange things would happen around the house. I have never been especially religious, and to this day I chalk it up to just a kid's imagination late at night. But for some reason it still feels so vivid to me. I remember distinctly being in one of the rooms just sitting when, in this well-lit room, it started to get darker. Not the bulb flickering, but just fading away. I freaked out and looked at the door, and it just closed. I scrambled to get up and run out, but what I remember the most is the walls. It might have been fear, but when I looked at them, they seemed to be moving like a current all around. It made me almost trip while I was running out. I curled up next to their dog and tried to rationalize for an hour. The next one I really doubt myself on, but the pure cold fear it put in me, I can still feel when I think about it. I had ditched the idea of sleeping in any of the rooms and was laid out on the couch. The TV had been turned off, and I could barely get to sleep. Things got really strange around 2 a.m. I rolled over and looked at the glass cabinets holding their DVDs, which in the moonlit room gave a perfect reflection of the sliding glass doors behind me. I still perfectly remember the outline. Looking at the glass in the reflection, it was literally just a pair of goat legs. Long, thick legs that led to a strange upper torso hidden behind the curtain that covered half of the doors. The most primal instinct of don't move hit me, and I laid there in the most paralyzing fear for what felt like an eternity. It was just standing there, looking straight at the glass, right next to it, just inches from touching it, only feet away from where I was. They lived near an overpass, and every once in a while, a truck would pass by, shining light over the wall and into the sliding glass doors. When the light outlined it through the curtain, the closest thing I can compare it to is the upper body of the Taurus demon from Dark Souls, but thinner and lankier, staring into the wall. I could never see its head. The reflection ended at its shoulders. Sometime during my silent terror, daybreak started to hit and my mom got up, opening doors and moving around her room. I looked over to her and then back at the reflection, and it was gone. I have never felt relief like that since, and have never had a single paranormal experience again. I scoured that backyard for anything that could have cast a shadow that detailed, but nothing was behind the sliding glass doors except patio chairs. Story 2. One time at a party in the park, my parents made me watch my little brother. I was about 8 or 9. He was about 1 to 2. Anyway, I ended up losing him. I started freaking out, running around looking for him. By this time, everyone had figured out what had happened, and they all started looking for him. My mom was upset and yelling at me, making me feel bad as I kept searching. I remember I saw him heading toward the street, so I started running after him. I caught him just as he was crossing the street and almost got hit by a car. My dad showed up and took my brother from me. By this time, I was going into a kind of shock, I guess, because I was sulking, shaking, stuttering, weak and pale, and I couldn't respond when everyone was asking me questions. Eventually, everyone at the party got my mom to calm down and leave me alone since I was clearly very distressed. They gave me ice to chew on to help calm my nerves, I guess. I will never forget that day. It still makes me emotional thinking about it. Story 3. Mine's not the scariest, but it's quite recent, and at the time I was filled with nothing but dread. I was on my first shift as a supervisor in a coffee shop. We were getting on with the cleaning when I turned to my colleague and asked if they had cleaned one of the bathrooms because it was locked. This was after closing, and I was about to count the takings for the day and couldn't for security reasons. She said she hadn't, so I knocked on the door and asked if anyone was in there, with no reply. I rang my manager, who asked me to phone security for the shopping center we were based in, but at this point, they had gone home for the day. I was then instructed to ring 999. I explained the situation to the operator, who asked me to open the door. My colleague looked at me like he was mad, and I refused. He asked, "What's the worst you expect to find?" And adrenaline was pumping, so my mind was overactive, and I said anything from a burglar to a bomb or a body. I didn't want to find out. He said the best he could do was get someone there in 15 minutes, but if I could try to work out the CCTV and see anything, then if I rang back, he'd put out an emergency call. So after 10 minutes fiddling with the computer, I figured out the CCTV and we started watching. My colleague and I were sitting there when we saw an elderly woman go into the toilet. So we waited. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. At this point, I rang back and said I had seen an elderly woman go into the toilets, but no one was answering when I knocked. My manager arrived, and within 5 minutes, so did the emergency services. The firemen opened the door and found nothing. In that moment, I thought an elderly lady had hurt herself on the other side of the door. All I could feel was dread. Then for the rest of the night, I was in complete frustration because when I went back to show my manager the footage, it was gone. However, earlier in the night, you see a teenager touch the door as if to check if it's occupied, then walk away like he doesn't need it. We suspect he locked it and caused a panic for no reason. As for the footage of the lady, we have no idea where that's gone, but I can take solace in the fact that my colleague watched it with me and I wasn't just seeing things. Story 4. I normally go with one of two scary moments that happened to me around junior high school that gave me a serious scare, but they weren't very serious events. But since this thread seems to be more into serious things, I'll go with something I don't often talk about from my military service. Around 2007, I served near the Gaza Strip in the IDF in the Armored Corps. Part of my time there was during a pretty aggressive period. We would sometimes do skirmishes inside the strip to target Hamas terrorists almost on a daily basis. Sometimes it would be big operations with an entire platoon of tanks and a whole brigade of infantry for 48 plus hours. Basically, the idea was for our forces to go in, take positions, and wait for Hamas fighters to come engage. This reduced civilian presence in combat zones and saved us the trouble of searching. They ideologically couldn't allow our forces to be there, so they had to fight us. One day, while we were engaging some Hamas troops, my squad was chasing down a few who were firing RPGs at our tanks. We usually ignored rifle fire unless we were protecting infantry. They were running between buildings at the edge of the town, occasionally peeking to fire. The civilians seemed to have fled, so we weren't as concerned about collateral. At one point, I saw one doing a few peek fires around a corner and got authorization from my commander to take him out. I waited patiently for the next peek to fire with the machine gun. I saw him sneak a peek and assumed he was about to jump out and fire. I held tightly to my controls, fingers slightly pressing on the trigger, when suddenly a figure jumped behind the wall. I almost fired, but somehow, my brain processed what I saw just in time. My heart skipped a beat. A small girl, probably around 5 years old, was pushed into the open, probably so I'd shoot her and they could use it for propaganda. The little girl stood in awe, facing our tanks a few hundred meters away, then burst into tears. She tried to run back behind the wall, but I saw two hands with a weapon shoving her back, denying her escape. I don't think I've ever been more scared and enraged by what someone almost made me do. I've had several mildly interesting or intense events during my service, but I don't think any of them compare to this. I know there are plenty of people with strong opinions about Israel-Palestine, but please refrain from starting a debate for the sake of the thread. Story 5. When I was around 6th grade, my friends and I were playing in the street, and this older boy, maybe around 11th grade, from our local orphanage, decided he'd hang out with us too. We were young, so we let him, but our parents didn't like him much. After a while, we noticed he acted really strange. He would often hide behind one of the bushes and apparently watch us while doing inappropriate things until one of the kids saw him and asked what he was doing. Then he disappeared for a while, and winter came. I got up for school one morning and noticed that our front door was open and the key was missing. Our house has a fence and an outer door leading to the front garden, and next to it is the garage, which you can easily get on top of from our neighbor's fence. She has a fancy metal swirled fence that works like a ladder. I noticed someone had gotten up through the fence, onto the garage and into our garden. I followed the footsteps. They circled all around the house. We have a lot of windows. I called my mom out and she took a look too. We changed the locks later that same day. Around 10 p.m., our neighbor knocked on the door and my mom went to see what was going on. After about 10 minutes, she came back inside and called the police. Apparently, our neighbor had been coming home later than usual and saw someone trying to unlock our door. He ran over and caught the guy. It was the boy from the orphanage. The police took him in for questioning. Apparently, he had entered our yard and was peeping through windows, trying to take photos of me, 11-year-old me. likely for his own disturbing reasons. The police seized his phone and released him 24 hours later. He fled the city after that, and I haven't seen him since. But it's still the creepiest moment of my life. I use double curtains now, even in an apartment on the 6th floor. Story 6. Mine's a near-death experience. Family holiday to Val d'Isere for a ski trip. I'm a decent snowboarder, been chasing snow for the last few years, so I was totally confident to go off-piste, backcountry, by myself. I had a camelback and some snacks. The outer mountains do have some attendants running lifts, but it's pretty bare bones. I did a cross run to a chairlift that led me to a peak with a little hut at the top. By this point, I'd been boarding for 3 to 4 hours, so I thought I'd chill for 10 minutes, have a smoke and snack before getting back into it. Mind you, my phone at this point says -8 degrees Celsius. No biggie, that's normal there. As I'm sitting, I notice a huge rolling fog heading toward me, enveloping mountains as it went. This was my first ever vision of a blizzard, but I didn't realize. Within minutes, the blizzard was on me. All I could think was, oh no, I have to get down this mountain. I literally strapped up and started boarding down, and the blizzard was on me. The initial path I had to board down was a long zigzag, but it wasn't steep at all. I had been down the run before and seen people walking who hadn't gained enough speed to follow through the multiple zigzags. Within 5 minutes, a massive amount of snow had fallen to the point there was no slope at all. I checked my phone and the temperature had dropped to -27 degrees, and it died that moment from the cold and pulling it out of my inner pocket. I trudged through the recently fallen powder. It was tough. I was really tiring quickly. I wasn't cold. Gear-wise, I had thermals on, good jacket, pants, helmet, beanie, face mask, etc. The walking got way too hard at some point. I was heating up internally. Again, I was thinking, I'm not cold. I remember wanting to pull my jacket open to cool down a little as I was actually getting pretty hot and sweaty. But somehow, from some nature documentary or something, I knew it was a bad idea. I thought about onset hypothermia and if it was affecting me now. I decided to lay on my snowboard and use it practically like a surfboard and pull myself across the fresh powder. This worked really well. I was getting far, but this was tiring too. I kept going for ages and eventually stopped to get a breath. Stopping was bad though. I was leaning against a rock wall and basically feeling like I wanted to go to sleep. I remember saying in my head, "You can't sleep now." But my body wanted sleep so badly. Still, I forced myself up and kept using my previous method until I reached the end of the zigzag. At this point, I pretty much had to traverse across the mountain to get to a part that had a decent rundown. Mind you, I haven't mentioned this whole time. Visibility was 0. I could barely make out anything the whole time. Also at this part of the mountain, not as much powder had built up, and at various points I could walk or snowboard to help me start getting some rhythm in the situation. Literally squatting and panting as I glided along, only standing for patches of powder. As I was going along, I saw shapes in the distance that weren't the path markers. I knew it was other people. I didn't have the breath to shout. I ran, tumbled at points to get to them. And I did. It was a British couple. They were in the exact same situation as me and just as terrified. I can't remember their names. I wish I did. We agreed to stick together the whole way to the bottom. We continued together, traversing along the path. It was hard work. We continued individually at times when 1 or 2 of us would gain momentum and zoom past the third who fell over due to exhaustion. Still, we never got that far from each other, even when we couldn't momentarily see one another. We eventually reached a good part of the mountain where there's a really nice slope winding down to the bottom. I'm doing this on my phone, but when I get home, I'm mapping this out and finding what route we did and what mountain this actually was. Anyway, we started our descent. We were so exhausted. We often tumbled from exhaustion, but we got there. I remember the relief of being at the bottom. I literally kissed the ground in happiness and walked to the bus stop with the British couple. No one was around. We waited for the bus to the main town in Val d'Isere, where we were all staying. The bus came. Silence the whole way home. We got off in town, hugged, and made our way to our apartments. I walked into mine and immediately went to the shower, stripping on the way, groaning in agony. My brother was confused, getting up from bed facing the TV. These apartments were tiny, hot water on, relief spreading through me. Then straight to the bottle of scotch we had brought back from Edinburgh. 2 swigs, then literally passing out in blissful sleep. And thank goodness after all that, I'm here. Story 7. My mother, 63, had a pretty tragic childhood. She grew up on a farm with a sister and brother, her being the middle child just a couple of years apart from each of them. Her father worked for the gas company and needed help with farm work. He had a longtime friend who was down on his luck. They made a deal for his friend to live in a small house on the property for free, be paid a wage, and eat all meals with the family in exchange for helping around the farm. Everything was great. My mother was 5 years old at the time. One night, while my grandfather was at work, the man came into the house with a weapon and ordered my grandmother, her mom, to undress. All 3 kids were watching. He proceeded to assault her while threatening her. When he was done, he harmed her fatally. He then turned to the kids and said, "You tell anyone anything, and I'll do the same to you." Fast forward a couple of years. Her dad remarried and was relieved to have a partner to help with the kids. This woman, who had a few kids of her own, turned out to be bitter and cruel, mistreating my mom and her siblings behind my grandfather's back. But that's not where this story's going. This new woman's father, my mom's new step-grandfather, was a predator. He would come to the house when my grandfather was at work and would repeatedly abuse my mother. She tried to tell, but her new stepmom prevented her from reaching her father about it for a long time. My mom told me she would lock herself in her room and pray to be saved from this man. Eventually, the abuse stopped. My mother once sat at the window, watching her abuser trying to fix his broken-down tractor. All of a sudden, something happened, and he ended up setting himself on fire. My mother sat there silent, watching this man suffer. It took several minutes of him flailing before he finally stopped. I cannot imagine going through what my mom endured as a child. She went on to raise me and my sister, along with 2 stepkids. She has been a wonderful mother and woman. Story 8. Last August, I went to a camping party with a guy I was head over heels for. He knew how I felt about him and how much I trusted him. I only knew him at the party, and I trusted him with my life. I remember him handing me drinks and food and such. I started to feel drowsy. I had only had 3 drinks, so I decided to go back to my tent to sleep. I then woke up. It was dark, so I couldn't see, but I could make out that his friend was on top of me. My clothes were torn off, and you can guess what was happening. The worst part was that I couldn't move. I just had to lie there while it happened. I felt everything, and there was nothing I could do. I spoke to my friend the next morning, and he acted like he already knew what had happened. I put 2 and 2 together and realized that he had drugged me, so his friend could do that to me. I went to the police. They refused to take evidence, wrote a vague statement, and accepted him saying I didn't do it without question. I even remember the officer I spoke to saying, "Well, if you were unconscious, how do you know you didn't agree?" Each time I ask for the case to be reopened, they yell at me and tell me to stop wasting their time. I will never trust the police again. Story 9. A pre-story, then the main one. My sister owned my car before I did. While she owned this car, she was dating an older guy. They had been together for a while, but he creeped her out. Turns out the guy was married with kids. Once she found that out, she immediately ended the relationship. Well, this guy's wife began sending threatening messages to my sister. She started getting stalked by a certain SUV that belonged to the guy. Long story short, it just stopped one day. A few months later, I bought the car, worked on it some, tinted the windows, got it into a more street-ready state since I enjoyed racing. The license plate was the same. Well, one night, this custom-painted silver and black Ford Explorer with a state sticker in the window pulled up next to me and tried racing. At the first stoplight, I didn't do anything, as is my rule, and I wasn't in the mood to race. Second stoplight, they tried again, but I still didn't want to. The third light, I got tired of them, so I took off. They weren't really a match, or more likely, they knew I was going to do that. They immediately got behind me and started following. I knew it wasn't a cop from the start. I thought maybe they were taking a similar route, smaller town after all. I took a few turns and they were within 10 feet of my car. I started turning without signaling, and they were right on my tail. I finally started to turn right, then took a hard left into a neighborhood, throwing them off for just a second. Once in the neighborhood, happened to be my friend's neighborhood, I sped up, pulled into my buddy's driveway, shut the car off, and got out and under my car when I saw them drive by slowly, looking around. 2 people in the car. The passenger looked like they had a bat. I told my sister about it later, describing the SUV. I tell her most everything. She got really quiet and asked me to describe it again. Turned out to be the older guy's SUV. More than likely, they were still looking for my sister. Story 10. I had a pretty severe blood disorder that made my spleen destroy all the platelets in my blood. I had my spleen removed in hopes that it would cure the blood problems. The surgery was a success. However, once surgery was over and while in recovery, I heard a huge cracking noise upon taking a deep breath, and suddenly I could not breathe. Turns out I had developed massive blood clots in my lungs, and it was so bad that they didn't think I was going to make it. All I really remember is the doctors kept giving me pain medication, one after another, because they weren't working. Eventually, I passed out. When I came to, it was nighttime, and I was all alone in my dark room. I couldn't talk, let alone breathe, and I couldn't reach my buzzer for help. I was utterly terrified. This was hands down the scariest experience of my life. You don't truly appreciate the ability to breathe until it's taken from you. Thank goodness I had a roommate who woke up and called the nurses for me. I was so freaked out that I made the doctors promise not to leave me alone again, so they put me in the ICU. Why they didn't do that in the first place is beyond me. Story 11. I got a phone call at work around 8 a.m. from a friend who worked at the sheriff's department. She said there had been an attempted break-in at my house and that I needed to get home ASAP. This was before cell phones. I drove home extremely fast and found several police cars in my yard. One of them had two men in the back, and there was a random car in the yard. We lived out in the country, and my house could not be seen from the road. Here's what happened. My two older children had been sleeping inside alone, ages 13 and 11. It was a teacher work day at their school, so they were home. They woke up because my very small dog was barking like crazy. He was doing this because my big outside dog had caught the two men after they entered our yard to rob the house. Big Dog held them at bay, while little buddy inside woke up the kids, who called the police. The police were waiting on me to come home so I could secure my animal so they could gather evidence. Even the sheriff was a little afraid of her, Big Dog. My kids weren't entirely sure what was going on, and the sheriff didn't want them to open the door because he didn't want Small Dog, still barking loudly, to get out. Big Dog weighed 30 pounds and Little Dog weighed 8 pounds. Turns out the men had been robbing the area for months and knew everybody's work schedules. They just didn't plan on our dogs interfering. Big Dog messed them up pretty badly, and Small Dog got so frantic that he was exhausted for the rest of the day. Both of them got lots of treats. Story 12. I work as a local TV photojournalist. I've seen a lot of awful accidents. Never too close, and we can't show the disturbing details on the news. But I've seen some rough things. It's never really bothered me at all. I'm not trying to sound tough or anything, and sometimes I wonder if there's something wrong with me. But that's just how it is. There was one night that rattled me more than anything else. It was 2:30 in the morning in January, and it was a slow night, so I was going out to get something to eat. As soon as I left the station, I saw flames shooting out of an upper-story window in the high-rise retirement home next door. It looked pretty serious, so I called the station to ask if they'd heard about it on the scanner. They hadn't. I was already there when I realized I was the only one on the scene. I heard sirens in the distance, so I knew help was coming. I grabbed my camera and started filming. That's when I heard it. There was an elderly woman trapped on the balcony, and she was screaming, "Help me! Help me! I'm on fire!" I had a 400mm lens, and I could see her fingers poking out from under the edge of the railing, with smoke and flames pouring out all around her. It only took a few minutes for a ladder truck to get there, but it felt like hours. She was too large to be brought down the ladder, so they had to wait until the fire was out to bring her down through the front door. But it was too late, and she passed away in the ambulance. Being there through the whole thing was frightening, but by the end, it looked like she had been rescued. The hardest part was editing the footage later and hearing her yelling for help, knowing that she didn't survive. Story 13. When I was around 16, I went through a period that lasted a few weeks or maybe a month where I was staying up late on the computer and only getting a few hours of sleep. Because of that, I started seeing things, like people sitting beside me that weren't actually there, always in the corner of my eye. Every time I turned to look at them, they were gone, and I thought it was a ghost because my logic was so off due to the sleep deprivation that I actually believed that. It was hard to admit to myself that I was hallucinating because I always thought that was something only crazy people did. And I didn't want to be locked up or mistreated for something I couldn't control. It didn't help that I was basically addicted to my smartphone and laptop, which is why I stayed up so late and had to wake up early for school. Luckily, it was just a brief period, and I eventually went back to normal. Story 14. When I was 6, the neighbor girl and I were playing at her house and we noticed a car kept driving up and down the alley. We thought it was a little creepy, so we went to the front yard, where older neighborhood kids could see us, to play instead. It had a taller fence and gate, which was probably safer than the short 3.5-foot tall fence in the backyard that an adult could easily jump over. We weren't allowed to play in the house since her mom was cleaning. It wasn't the best neighborhood, with multiple apartment complexes on the street. We were already on edge because of the car. A few minutes later, it pulled up outside the house. A man got out and told us that our mom was injured in a car crash and we needed to go to the hospital immediately. He didn't specify whose mom, presumably, so either of us might believe it. Since we were taught not to talk to strangers, we said nothing. The man opened the gate and started walking toward us, and we tried to head for the house. He actually began to run at us, but my friend yelled for her mom, which made him realize we weren't alone. He immediately turned around, ran back to his car, and drove off. We told her mom, who then told mine. We called the police and gave a description of the man in the car. They never followed up, but we never saw him again, thankfully. A few months later, my dad, who was mentally unstable, tried to take me from the front porch while my back was turned. I screamed and struggled long enough that my mom heard and delayed him, just enough for my stepdad to rush home and stop it. I was playing with the same neighbor girl at the time, so she was around both times I was nearly taken. Both events happening so close together kind of traumatized me. Now I get extremely anxious if someone is walking behind me or steps out of a vehicle and approaches in my direction. The last time something remotely similar happened was when a van pulled up next to me. They only handed me a pamphlet for a new church in town and drove off. That encounter was much more pleasant than the others, that's for sure. Story 15. Definitely not as intense as some of the stories here, but my male dog is incredibly intuitive about people and has gotten between me and others when he senses I'm in danger. Keep in mind he's a 14-pound mini dachshund, so he's not exactly intimidating. One night, I was home alone with the dogs. We have two, him and our little female mini dachshund, who's about 10 pounds and a total goofball. I don't handle being alone at night very well. Normal noises, like the creaking of the house or the water heater kicking in, tend to freak me out. It was early spring, and with the weather warming up, the house creaked more than usual as the wood expanded. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, the girl dog was under my feet, and the male was chilling in the living room. Suddenly, he picked his head up and stared into the hallway that led to the stairs, then prowled to the bottom step. He looked up the staircase and let out the most vicious snarl I've ever heard. The hair on his back stood up, his lips curled back, exposing his teeth, and for a moment, I didn't recognize my dog. I could literally see the wildness in him. It was terrifying. I ended up grabbing both dogs and running out of the house, calling my parents in tears. They came home as fast as they could. It turned out my dog had heard the neighbor in his garage, but the acoustics made it sound like it was coming from upstairs. I don't doubt for a second that he would defend me with his life if it ever came down to it. Story 16. I worked for another hospital a few years ago in security. I got called to the ambulance bay where a young 2-year-old boy was being brought in, and I was called on the radio because the parents were in the ambulance and were very distraught. Understandably, of course, to the point where they were interfering with the paramedics. When they arrived, the ambulance bay opened up, and there was a paramedic sitting on the stretcher doing CPR on the young boy, and blood was coming out of his mouth as the CPR continued, while the other paramedics rushed him to the pediatric ER. When they got him in the room, I was assigned to keep the mother and father out so the medical staff could do their jobs, and having to physically hold the frantic parents of a 2-year-old who was choking on a piece of food, it was still stuck, was hard enough. The pain and frustration they felt, they hated me for preventing them from being next to their child. The worst part of this moment, the ER team revived the boy, and within hearing distance of the parents said that they had a pulse and that he was stabilized. The sense of relief those parents had, and then having it taken away a few moments later when they lost the child for good. The scream from the mother, the devastation from the father. I had to go home after that. My boss sent me home. My son had just turned 2 years old not long before this happened. I couldn't help but put myself in their shoes and slowly feel like I was falling apart with them. I've seen gunshots, suics, and some pretty violent assaults, including a decapitation situation in my short time in healthcare. That young boy still shows up in my mind every time I look at my own son. Story 17. A little late to the game, so not sure if this will be seen, but this is about my father's car crash with two young, intoxicated drivers and how he told it to me. Our family has a condo on the Jersey Shore. Yes, same place as that TV show. And we would travel there every year in the summer together for a family vacation. Getting there involves going through Pennsylvania, one lane in each direction, 55-mile-per-hour roads with mountains on one or both sides. My dad's wife, not my mother, was 9 months pregnant with my older brother, sitting in the front seat on the way back from the condo. It was dark out on this road with no street lighting. My father was driving his '70s sedan. Not much traffic since it was late at night. Lights appeared ahead of him like any other normal car passing. A quarter-mile in front of him, the vehicle briefly swerved into his lane, but went back within seconds. No big deal, just looked like a mistake. About 100 feet before passing, it swerved back into his lane again. My dad only said one word: great. At 55 miles per hour, they hit head-on. My dad gripped the steering wheel so hard at positions 3 and 9 o'clock that he bent the steering wheel toward the front of the car. Luckily, both he and his wife were okay, other than some deep cuts and bruises. He stumbled out to check on the other car, which was a small 2-door convertible with the top down. In front of their car, he saw this pink-looking stuff all over the road, didn't think much of it, and continued to approach. He got to the vehicle and saw that both of their heads had been severely injured at the brow line by the sharp edge of where the windshield met the convertible cover. That pink stuff on the road? That was brain matter scattered on the pavement. He said he had terrible nightmares for years, and I don't blame him. This was one of those stories your father only tells once. He had a picture of the other car. It was torn to pieces. Both my father and his wife were okay after some stitches, and my brother's all good and healthy. Story 18. Being shot at in the Mojave Desert while me and my dad were camping off the Interstate 15 in California. We were camping, shooting guns, riding ATVs, at least 7 miles from the freeway. Around dusk, we saw an old 1990s Honda Accord roll by our camp with 4 guys in it. They pulled up, cruised by, and took off. I waved, thinking it was a bit odd. About a half hour later, I started hearing a .22 rifle going off. It sounded really close. My dad pointed and told me to look at the guy on the hill about 500 yards away. We could barely make out his silhouette. The sun was going down. We were yelling, "Stop shooting!" But this guy started firing at us. I couldn't believe it. The first round went right into our campfire. He kept taking random shots at us every 10 to 20 minutes. So me and my dad crawled under our truck and stayed there for about 9 hours with an SKS rifle. We finally got in our truck and left everything. Ease-up canopy, Yeti cooler, $500 tent, behind, just hauling out to the freeway. Story 19. My scariest moment by far has got to be when my son was about 1 week old. He was a horrendous sleeper. He screamed every hour, night and day. I had an awful infection from my cesarean and was completely exhausted with the onset of postnatal depression. My son woke for another feed around 2 a.m. His father and I both woke up, fed him a bottle, changed him, and decided to cuddle him in bed to help settle him. The next thing I knew, I jolted upright in bed. We had both fallen asleep with our son still in the bed, except he had somehow wriggled his head under my pillow. All I could see were his little legs, and he wasn't moving. I instantly grabbed his legs and pulled him out from under the pillow. He was fast asleep and just opened his eyes and looked up at us. That moment is frozen in my mind forever. I'll never forget seeing his legs poking out from under the pillow. Story 20. The first would be being woken up by cops shining a flashlight in my face at age 7 because our house was being raided by the police. The second is when my parents and I were driving down our street after getting my Halloween costume and saw an ambulance and a bunch of police cars at our house. My brother was covered in blood, screaming, and being held down by several officers in the front yard. Apparently, he had mixed alcohol with his mood stabilizers and had a psychotic break. He tried to harm my sister. She wasn't hurt. She and her friend had jumped out a window and ran to a neighbor's house to call for help. In his rage, he managed to snap a broom handle in half and severed an artery in his wrist. All I could think about was calling my friend. They told me not to go inside, but I was young and didn't understand why. I opened the door to a house that was completely destroyed, with blood everywhere. All night I was upset about not being able to go to a Halloween party that was going on, and I had to stay with our neighbors so they could clean up the mess. Story 21. Probably close to 10 years ago now. It was summer and I was hanging out with a small group of friends. Some other friends had recently moved to the next town over, so one evening we were bored and decided on a whim to drive to their new place. I remember getting out of the car and walking to the porch. The friend was in a pile on the ground, in hysterics, shouting, "She's dead! She's dead! She's dead!" over and over, referring to her 12-year-old sister by name. Those of us who had just arrived were confused and in shock. Upon going inside, we found the rest of the family in varying stages of shock, grief, and pain. We eventually learned that the family had been out on a boat enjoying the lake when the sister and brother decided to go out with a couple of others for one last cruise before dark. A man who had been drinking was also out there joyriding and rear-ended their boat with such force that he flew over the top of it and landed on the front before speeding away. The girl had been struck in the head and passed away from her injuries. They had just gotten home from the hospital when we arrived. She was a light extinguished far too soon, and I will never forget the image of her fragile little body laying in her casket at her funeral, or the impact her death had on her family and their large circle of friends. Story 22. My dad owns a towing company, and back in the 80s or 90s, he went to a call where a family had wrecked their van on the interstate pretty badly, and they were all trapped inside. Firefighters were able to get the dad and the kids out, but the mom was in the driver's seat and was somehow completely pinned in on multiple sides. As they were working to get her out, the van burst into flames, making it impossible for the firefighters to continue due to the serious risk of explosion. The only option they had was to stand back while the vehicle burned. All of the responders had to watch this woman lose her life because they couldn't save her in time. There was nothing anyone could do. I know it still haunts my dad to this day. He has several other disturbing stories from work, but that one stands out the most. Story 23. When I was in the summer after my 8th grade year, my then-girlfriend's brother called me to say he was locked in the bathroom of his house with a knife and was about to hurt himself. My heart stopped. Knowing how hard the divorce was on him, the teasing he got at school, never serious enough to involve school officials, and how someone he liked had publicly humiliated him, I immediately knew he wasn't joking. I spent the next 3 hours hidden behind my parents' bedroom door, since our phone had a cord and I couldn't go far, trying to talk him out of it. I didn't convince him not to do it forever, but I convinced him not to do it that day. As soon as I got off the phone, I called my girlfriend, his sister, and she contacted emergency services. He ended up getting help and went to therapy. He hated me for the next 4 or 5 years. I almost got grounded for using the phone so long. I wasn't open with my parents back then, so I tried to keep the whole situation to myself. We're still friends on Facebook, but don't talk anymore. Still, he's alive, and I'm grateful for that, even if things didn't end well with his sister. Story 24. I was assaulted when I was 16 by someone I thought was a family friend. I was sleeping on the couch in the basement, away from everyone else because my father was having another one of his substance-fueled parties, and I didn't like the people he invited. A man named Eric came downstairs. I didn't think anything of it. He'd always been kind and seemed like a decent person. He was at least 6 feet 3 inches and 300 pounds. I was 5 feet 3 inches and barely 140 pounds. I closed my eyes and tried to fall back asleep. But before I could, I felt him touching me. At first, I thought it was an accident, so I lay still and pretended to be asleep. But he kept going. I was terrified and continued pretending to be asleep the entire time. It felt like hours. I've never felt fear like that in my life. I froze. And I always thought of myself as someone who would fight back. But I just froze, out of sheer terror. And I had a reason. I later found out he had just gotten out of prison for multiple assault charges. I'm 22 now and still see him around town sometimes. Story 25. When I was a kid, I grew up in a housing complex for police officers and their families, with apartments provided by the government. The units were pretty small: 1 bedroom, 1 lounge, 1 kitchen, 1 bathroom, and toilet. On average, a family of 4 lived in each apartment. We were close to our neighbors, especially the family next door. One night, the neighbor lady came over, chatted with us, and everything seemed normal. She had two sons, and her husband was a police officer. The next morning, I was sitting with my mom, sister, and visiting grandma. My dad was on a UN mission to Yugoslavia at the time. A random lady knocked on our door saying something had happened next door. At the same time, our cat ran outside and into their apartment. My mom asked me to get the cat while she spoke with the woman, who turned out to be the neighbor lady's sister. Their door was slightly open. I stepped inside and saw three bodies on the floor, our neighbor and her two sons lying in a pool of blood. The husband had taken all of their lives. I was only 8, now I'm 25. And I didn't fully understand it back then, but now I do. It's terrifying to realize a police officer did that, and my dad not being around made it worse. I still have that image burned into my mind. I even remember the date, April 22nd. I've never seen anything worse since. Story 26. Stayed in a hotel downtown Hamilton. I was traveling alone, female, and about 23 at the time. I was only there for an interview since I was unemployed. Around 5:30 p.m., I went out to find a restaurant, as I hadn't eaten all day. There was a mall attached to the hotel, but everything was closed at that time. I decided to walk down the street near the hotel where most of the restaurants were. A group of 5 middle-aged men walked out of a store and surrounded me. It seemed like they were either intoxicated or under the influence of something. They asked me to buy their prescriptions for them. I told them I didn't have any money. They replied that I should be able to afford at least one and said they'd make it up to me. I repeated that I didn't have money. I'll never forget the look in their eyes. They started to get angry and shouted at me. When I tried to walk away, they blocked me and got more aggressive. People walked by as this was happening, and I tried to talk to them, but they ignored me and walked away with their heads down. I knew I had to handle this myself, so I thought, just do it. I pushed past them and went into the nearest well-lit place I could find. I'm surprised they didn't grab me, but they followed me and kept shouting until I entered a restaurant. They stayed outside, staring at me for what felt like hours. I told the restaurant staff what had happened, and they told me it's a common issue in that area. I chose a seat that faced away from the window and stayed there for about 2 hours. I never looked back out the window. Before I left, I checked to see if they were still there. Thankfully, they were gone. I hurried back to the hotel, avoiding that area entirely. I never walked down that street again unless I was with someone. Thinking back, I should have called the police once I was safe. Now I carry a safety tool in my purse when I go out alone. And for those wondering, I didn't accept the job there. Story 27. I know I'm a little late. I worked and volunteered for many years as an EMT. Because I'm an easygoing and personable guy, I was often sent on psychiatric transports. Being so close to New York City, the county I live in shut down all but one mental health service and just sent people into the city. Now, I don't know if this is the worst thing I saw. Many moments stick with me. But one case involved a young man from the Orthodox Jewish community who needed to be transferred for burn care and a psychiatric evaluation. He had knocked on his neighbor's door, thrown a can filled with gasoline and another substance at him, and set him on fire because his neighbor followed a different rabbi. That alone was horrifying. But the part that stuck with me was the way the young man looked and spoke as he sat in my ambulance. He said, "The courts cannot judge me because they are not Jewish. Only God can judge me. Only my people. And God and my people know what I did was the right thing." He said this over and over, not in what I'd call a crazy way, but more like he was calmly trying to help me understand that he believed he had done something good. I hesitated to share this story because I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't care what religion he followed. It's not about that. His faith isn't very different from my own. What saddened me deeply was the conviction in his voice, that someone could harm their neighbor and believe it was truly justified. Story 28. One of the scariest moments of my life was watching a sibling slowly be overtaken by schizophrenia. They refused to take their medication because they believed they were completely fine and that we were the crazy ones. The early signs were already unsettling, talking to themselves when they thought no one could hear, but it escalated to talking openly in front of everyone and acting like it was totally normal. But for me, the worst part was when they began speaking in total gibberish. I'll never forget the moment when they came up to me and said, "Hey, you ever think the Chinese are watching broccoli because the lungs will inflate and the fields will New York Then they couldn't finish whatever it was they were trying to say. They suddenly broke into laughter. snot flying, tears streaming, drooling from laughing so hard. And I just stood there, watching them collapse onto the floor, laughing uncontrollably. And I just stood there thinking, what? Story 29. This is the story of my dad, a man who worked many jobs, one of which was fixing medical equipment. One day he was called to a major psychiatric hospital, I won't name it for anonymity, to deliver some parts. As he was sitting in the waiting room to speak with a representative, a young man in a three-piece suit sat next to him and started a conversation. As they talked, my dad learned that the man was an electrician applying for a job at the hospital. He lamented that he had forgotten his tools at home and hoped they wouldn't ask him to demonstrate anything or question his forgetfulness. My dad, being a sympathetic blue-collar worker, offered to lend him his tools for the interview. The man was ecstatic and thanked him profusely. My dad excused himself to go to his car and fetch the tools. When he returned, the man was gone. He asked the receptionist where the electrician had gone, but she seemed confused. She explained that the only person who had been in the room when she came back was a patient who had wandered out of bounds by sheer luck and a bit of cunning, but had already been escorted back to his room by guards. She then asked if the electrician wore a three-piece suit. My dad said yes and mentioned he had brought the tools the man asked for. The receptionist turned ghostly pale and quietly explained that the person he spoke with was indeed the escaped patient, and that several people had narrowly avoided a serious situation. The man had been admitted for severely harming someone with scissors. He was known among the staff for being extremely manipulative, polite and charming one moment, violent and dangerous the next. He had escaped by stealing a doctor's coat and credentials. My dad said he'd never met someone as nice as that man. He hasn't stepped foot in a psychiatric hospital since. Story 30. Finding my fiancé in a chair on the front porch. No longer alive. This was about 3.5 days after he mentioned falling off a 2-step ladder at work. The next day, he lost consciousness at work and fell again, likely hitting his head on the driveway where he was standing. That evening, he was showing signs of a serious head injury, memory loss, imbalance, no hearing in one ear, vomiting, confusion, and extreme drowsiness. His boss didn't call an ambulance or take him to the ER, and by the time his boss brought him home, he was refusing treatment, saying he was fine. He passed away about 36 hours later. Best guess at the cause of death: brain hemorrhage. I was the first to find him that morning. Even though my brain saw what was happening, it refused to accept it at first. I spent a few minutes in total shock, crying and screaming at him to wake up, before I finally snapped out of it enough to wake his roommates and have them call an ambulance, though it was clear he was already gone. The sight of the man I was supposed to marry, the person I loved deeply, still haunts me almost every night. I have regular nightmares and flashbacks and can still remember exactly how he looked and the way he was sitting. Story 31. 2 months ago, I had just gotten home from picking up my youngest brother from school. Usually I would drop him off at my parents' house and head home, but that day I decided to stay. I saw my other brother's car there and figured he was probably napping before work. Zach, my 15-year-old brother, went upstairs to grab something and saw a note on the bathroom door. He came to get me. His face was pale. I said, "All right," thinking it was nothing serious. Josh, my 21-year-old brother, had left a long note taped to the door. I laughed at first, thinking he had trapped a big bug and wanted us to deal with it. But then I saw how long the note was. I skimmed to the bottom and read, "I love you all, Josh." I started screaming and grabbed Zach, and we ran to another room. I called my mom first, screaming at her to come home, and then called 911. When the police arrived, they wouldn't look me in the eye. Probably because I was 35 weeks pregnant, and they didn't want to overwhelm me. When my family arrived, they were in complete shock. That's when we found out Josh had taken his own life, using a shotgun he bought that day. Did we know he was struggling? Number, he hid it completely. Not even his closest friends knew. He was always so cheerful. We joked around all the time. It still haunts our entire family. We'll never really have closure. Story 32. Years ago, I worked as a concierge, mostly second shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. Toward the end of my shift, I was asked to bring an item up to a guest room. I didn't feel like walking all the way to the back of the hotel to use the service elevator, so I went to the main elevator in the lobby. When I got there, a woman was waiting to go up. I let her go first and told her I would take the next one. There were 3 elevators. She got in, and the doors closed. I waited for her elevator to go up before pressing the button, but after a moment I noticed it hadn't moved. So I pressed the button anyway, knowing her elevator would open back up, and it did. But it was completely, chillingly empty. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I told the front desk I was done for the night and explained why. The next day I told some of the housekeeping staff what happened. After I described what the woman looked like, they showed me an old staff photo from about 10 years ago, and there she was. She had been a staff member who was killed during a robbery in the gift shop, which had since been turned into a business center. A few housekeepers said they had seen her before, walking the halls late at night. Story 33. My assault. He was someone I thought was a friend. He came over one night and kissed me. We had been intimate before, and I had some feelings for him, feelings he didn't return, which led me to end things a couple of weeks prior. I kissed him back at first, but stopped when he tried to go further. He didn't stop. I told him no, that I didn't want to, that he needed to stop, but he kept going. As he pulled my pants off, he said, "I don't care what you want," and assaulted me. I wasn't on birth control, and he didn't use protection. I remember freezing, and I hated myself for it. When he was finished, I felt sick, terrified that I could end up pregnant. He stayed in my bed. I sat at my computer desk, shaking, smoking, staring into space. He asked me to cuddle with him, and I was too scared to say no, so I did. I lay awake all night convincing myself I had wanted it. I didn't go to school for a while afterward because I didn't want to see him. The second scariest thing I experienced was when he returned a week later. He threw food around my room, stomped on my feet hard enough to break toes because I asked him to stop, then grabbed a lighter and threatened to set my nightstand on fire. When I tried to stop him, he set my hair on fire. I was still too afraid to go to the police, so I never got justice. The only things that came from this were trauma, PTSD, and a suicide attempt. Story 34. The most bone-chilling story I know is one my mom told me. She was very close to being kidnapped, assaulted, or worse. This was back in the early 80s when she was about 17 or 18. She used to take back roads at night because she was still learning how to drive and didn't feel comfortable on the highway. One night she noticed a car behind her that had been following her for a while. Suddenly it put one of those flashing lights on its roof, and this was in the middle of nowhere, around 1 a.m. She pulled over, and so did he. He walked up to her car and gave some fake reason why he'd pulled her over, insisting she needed to get out of the vehicle immediately. Thankfully, my mom refused and said she wanted a female officer to assist her. Eventually, he gave up and left. About a week later, a newspaper article came out. A girl around her age had been attacked and killed on that same road, at the same time, and by the same man. My mom barely escaped something awful. Story 35. My mom struggled with depression and eventually sought help after my older brother found her in a running car in the garage. Not long after, she met a man she wanted to marry, probably because she missed companionship, but he was a terrible person. After a year of emotional abuse, he convinced her to push all of us away, framing it like it was her own decision. We were all hurt, but we understood she still needed us. She worked at the same place I did. After 3 days of no calls and no shows, my boss, a family friend, went to check on her. She felt something was wrong and called the business where I worked to get me over to the house. We knocked and got no answer, even though her car was there and the dog was outside. The only way to see into her room was through the window on the door, and I was just tall enough to look in. I got a sick feeling instantly. She was lying still on the bed, unresponsive. I ran to the garage, got a crowbar, and broke the door open. There she was, lying on her bed, having taken her own life. Story 36. At around 15 years old, I was at the mall with my parents and a few friends. We were all eating at the food court, and I decided to run to the bathroom. For some reason, the food court bathroom in this mall is down a long hallway that's pretty isolated from the rest of the area. And you can't see the hallway from the bathroom door because it bends slightly. I finished and started to leave. As the bathroom door closed behind me, the men's room door just a few feet away opened, and an older, disheveled-looking man came out and grabbed at me. I fought him as hard as I could, but I was small back then, and he started dragging me toward the emergency exit at the far end of the hallway. He got me about a foot toward it when another man came out of the men's room and shouted, "Hey!" The guy let go of me and bolted out the emergency exit, triggering the alarm, but the man who yelled stayed to help me up and make sure I was okay instead of chasing after him. I was shaken and bruised but physically fine, and I just cried into this big, bald, tattooed guy's chest until I calmed down. For a moment, I truly thought I was going to be taken. What scared me even more was realizing afterward that he came out the second I left the bathroom. He had probably been waiting, not realizing someone else was in the men's room. Story 37. I used to be a firefighter up in Alaska. One call we had was a fire in the lower level of a split-level house. You know, where you walk in and go either upstairs or downstairs right away. The fire had started from something like a candle left burning that caught curtains on fire. I don't remember the exact cause. What scared me the most was how bad the fire was. It burned through the floor above us. So while my crew and I were on the bottom floor putting water on it, we started hearing creaking, then loud crashing noises as the ceiling came down around us. Luckily, none of us got hurt, and we were able to continue suppressing the fire as we evacuated the building. Later, we went back in to do salvage and overhaul. By then, the sun had started coming up, and there was more light. I looked up through the gaping hole where the ceiling had been, and I saw this massive TV on a stand leaning right into the hole. The only thing that probably kept it from falling on us earlier was the power cord or some debris wedging it in place. I realized I could have been crushed by that thing, and it still gives me chills thinking about it. Story 38. Not sure if anyone will see this since I'm pretty late, but here goes. My grandpa always told us this story as a warning about using heaters inside tents. It was him, my grandma, my mom, and my uncle out camping one weekend. There was another group of 3 young men, probably in their 20s, camping nearby. They all shared one tent, and since it was cold that night, they used a portable heater inside. Unfortunately, it was an old model without a safety shutoff, and at some point in the night, it tipped over. The tent caught fire. One of the guys got out unharmed, but the other 2 weren't as lucky. One woke up with his jeans already on fire. The other, in a panic, ran straight through the burning plastic of the tent. My grandpa said the melted plastic stuck to his skin. My grandpa drove the severely injured one to the hospital, while someone else drove the others. He said the screams were the worst sounds he had ever heard. He had to sell the car afterward because he could never get the smell out. To this day, I don't care how many safety features they put on portable heaters, I'll never have one inside a tent. Story 39. I was on a backpacking trip for a college class called Outdoor Leadership. I majored in recreation and tourism management. It's a real field of study. We reached our campsite for the night, and everyone was setting up and prepping dinner. We had small single-unit gas stoves, compact and commonly used for backpacking. I was sitting to the left of the instructor, who was having trouble lighting one of the stoves. He was fiddling with the nozzle and matches when I heard a faint hissing sound. Out of the corner of my eye, I suddenly saw a huge fireball shoot straight toward a student sitting to his right. She went up in flames instantly and started crawling away, screaming. The fire traveled up her legs, torso, and reached her neck. One of the guys in our group quickly grabbed a 10-gallon water container and dumped it on her. It didn't work at first, so he grabbed another and managed to put the flames out. She was screaming the whole time. The rest of us were just frozen in shock. The entire event took less than a minute, but it felt like forever. She was airlifted out. She suffered severe third-degree burns, but thankfully survived. The image of someone on fire crawling and screaming is burned into my memory. I can't go near one of those camping stoves anymore. Story 40. I was at the neighbor's house one night, hanging out with her. It was pretty late, maybe 1 to 2 a.m. My husband was at work, and her partner was out with a friend. Suddenly, we heard someone stomp quickly up the porch steps and try to yank open the storm door, attempting to break the latch. It didn't break. It went quiet, then we heard the person walk off the porch. We were both freaked out. My friend looked through the window and saw a man walking away from the yard, so she opened the door to get a better look. I saw him glance back when she opened the door, and he appeared to be taking off. We locked the door and barricaded it with some furniture, but we were still incredibly on edge. Neither of us had a working cell phone at the time. We started to calm down when we suddenly heard the windows being tampered with. The person was going around to every window trying to get in. We turned off the lights, went silent, and made our way to her room. That's when we heard the back door being kicked in. She had a baseball bat, and I grabbed a hammer. We stood near the kitchen, close to that door, yelling that we were on the phone with the police, even though we weren't, that we had a gun and were going to shoot. But this guy didn't stop. He wasn't there to rob us. He was after us. This was going to be something worse. We were terrified. I've never felt so trapped, like there was no way out.